And I also wanted someone who had the professional expertise and the ability and access to resources that a layman wouldn't have. There are a lot of people who use amateur detectives in their stories, and they do it very well, but especially being as inexperienced as I was at the time, I had no idea how I would make that plausible. So I decided to stick with kind of a traditional FBI character, Kelly Jones, who's, I don't know, it's funny because there's a lot of characters like that on TV now, women in their 30s who are a little bit socially stunted, you know, and who are tougher than they have to be almost because they're working in a man's world, but because of that, they're hard sometimes for the people in the stories with them to relate to.
You want me to answer that too?
Yes, please.
I think when Sophie was mentioning in her very long-winded way of some of us who are a little bit less graphic, I'm just kidding.
I think she just insulted me.
No, I do write. I've written 3 different series. I'm writing 2 currently, and I had my first series. And in all of them, I write what is sometimes referred to as a traditional mystery or a cozy mystery. I have amateur detectives, and so I don't have a lot of graphic violence or sex. There is sex, but it's not graphic. So it's fun. It's fun in the mystery community because we've all known each other for years, and I think one of the great things about being a writer is being able to be part of a community where we're all coming at the mystery genre from really different places, and yet all coming up with really, you know, wonderful, gripping books. At least I hope they are. I know that these are all wonderful authors, and I do think that whenever you come up with your protagonist and any of your characters, there's always a bit of autobiography that goes into them because we're calling on our life experiences to write stories, and all of us do that no matter what story we're writing. But I do think that often your first book is kind of most obviously autobiographical. And my first book was about a faux finisher, and I was at the time doing faux finishing. Does everyone remember what faux finishing was? It was big in the 90s, very big. Everybody wanted their walls to look Tuscan, you know, so I was doing that. I was sort of a failed anthropologist and trying to figure out what to do with my time, so I painted walls. But while you're painting walls, you're often, the faux finisher, the decorative painter, is like the last person on a construction site, usually, and if anyone's ever had any construction done or been part of the industry, you know that you're always late. So often you're working on a job site at 3 in the morning and desperately trying to get things done. To speed up the schedule. So I would often be on these rather abandoned construction sites in the middle of the night painting, and I would think up these wonderfully lurid stories for whatever reason because I read a lot and that's where my mind goes. And that was the idea, the sort of seed for my first character was, as Michelle was mentioning, if you have an amateur detective, it's important to have someone who can reasonably be in weird places at weird times, and I spent a lot of time in really incredibly, really wonderful mansions in Pacific Heights and Hillsborough and all over, and these incredible places, and I would have access to a lot of information that I shouldn't have had, a lot of access codes to get in and out of homes full of priceless art, for example. You'd often overhear things. People, when you're painting their house, people forget that you're there and say things that are sometimes something that I shouldn't be hearing. So all of these things sort of built, for me, created this wonderful protagonist. And then because I had to make her a little more interesting, because in fact, faux finishing, you'll find it hard to believe it's not all that interesting to talk about faux finishing. So I included another lifelong interest of mine, which was art forgery. And I'm not, in fact, an art forger. But I thought, why not make a protagonist a former art forger? Because that would give her an interesting kind of criminal history. Another issue with amateur detectives is why don't they just go to the police like a sane person? You know, if you trip over a body. So if you give someone a personal history, which would make it reasonable that they would not necessarily turn to the police quickly. it's a very useful thing to have. And then, of course, it's always useful to have contact with criminals in a mystery novel. So that was my first protagonist. And then the second one was a witch, and I'm not a witch, but, you know, what the heck. And by then I was working on my second series, and I just thought I would play around with the character. So I did do a character that I think is very much, very different from me, but allowed me to do a lot of research in an area that I'm very interested in, which is botanicals and herbal remedies and that kind of thing. But then I did give her a lot of autobiographical stuff. She's from a small West Texas town, which I know from my mother's family, so I sort of based a lot of her background on my mother's family's background. And you know, I think that all of us do that. It's really, really fun to kind of bring in parts of your past, but then twist it around and make it relevant in other ways.
And I just, because this is a local audience, I just want to throw this in here. Julie's actually from Oakland, and I think it would be fun for you to share with them what happened when you asked to set a series in Oakland.
Well, see, this is where it would be really useful if I were writing a grittier novel, because, yeah, when I was writing my second series, the first series I had my protagonist live in Oakland but work mostly in San Francisco because that's what I was doing at the time, and I really wasn't veering very far from my real life at that point. But since she was doing most of her work in San Francisco, that was great. That was fine. And the second book with my witch protagonist, I thought, well, you know, I love Oakland. I'm a big Oakland booster. I just love Oakland. I love San Francisco as well. But I thought, Oakland's so great, and you never see it in books, and why is that? And I said, you know, what we should do is base this in Oakland. And my editor, who's a Manhattanite, like a lot of editors with big publishing houses, there was a long pause, and then she said, no, I think San Francisco's really a better place to base a book. And I was like, really? But Oakland's great? And she's like, I'm thinking Detroit. I'm just thinking Detroit, I'm thinking Newark, I'm thinking, no, your witch needs to be somewhere else. So she wound up in the Haight-Ashbury, which is a great place to put a witch, I have to admit. It's a good place.
That story just never ceases to crack me up. So kind of in that vein, what I thought I would ask the two of you, who write maybe a little bit more graphic violence.
I have to get away from that word.
Are you all offended by the word graphic? They don't look offended, Michelle, sorry. Michelle is launching a new young adult fiction with 2 presses, which is quite a feat. Actually, why don't you tell them about that for a minute?
So yeah, I have 2 different projects that are going to start coming out next year, and one of them is a young adult trilogy with HarperCollins, and that's the basic story kicks off with a 16-year-old foster girl who wakes up on an operating table in a makeshift operating room in a warehouse, and she has an incision on her chest that's just been sewn up, and she doesn't know what happened to her, and she manages to escape and spends the rest of the book trying to figure out what was done to her and why. And so that's going to be trilogy, and then...
Was that autobiographical?
Yes, it was. It was. I can't tell you. I mean, it's exactly why I fainted last week. I just have bad flashbacks.
You have the kidney back now, right?
Well, that's the whole thing. The incision isn't in her back; it's in her chest.
Is it?
Right? Yeah, it's strange. And then the other book, Soho, I don't know if anyone knows Soho Press. They're a really wonderful small press with a lot of local. Cara Black is probably their better known author. She lives up in Noe Valley, and she writes these wonderful mysteries set. Each one takes place in a different arrondissement in Paris. So if you love Paris and you love mysteries, that's a great series to check out. But anyway, they're launching a teen line, and my book for them is going to be called Strangelets, and it's going to have a little bit more of a sci-fi edge. It's going to be set in the near future with a group of teenagers who have something very strange happen to them. But it was interesting to switch from writing graphic thrillers to trying to do something similar for teens but toned down. I mean, I really had to go back through. I just wrote it as I would write any of my books, and then went back at the end and did a search for all the bad words and toned those down. But I very rarely put sex scenes in my books. It's just not something that ever seems to come organically into the narrative. And, I always get a little bit annoyed when I'm reading a thriller and the whole book takes place over the course of a day and a half, and people are running and detonating bombs and trying to, diffuse tensions and escape from bad guys. And they're like, and now let's stop and rip off our clothes and have sex. I just, they're, every once in a while it works, but by and large I always feel like, really? Because, they're right outside.